Foreign policy. When somebody says foreign policy, what is it that you think of? Do you think of the United States intervening with other countries? Do you think of the United States playing a military role or a humanitarian role? Do you think of the United States and our interactions with other countries when it comes to trade? Another question I want you to think of is, why should the U.S. even be involved with foreign nations? Given our excellent quality of life and the power we have, it can be our duty of the American people to exercise power to defend our way of life and promote this great way of life abroad in other countries. The United States should be involved in foreign affairs, but there can be instances when foreigners accuse the United States of butting in to other countries' problems or using our power unfairly. So those are some of the things that I want you to consider over the next couple of slides. Actors on the world stage. Some of this should be a review. Okay, we have international organizations. International organizations are organizations that multi-states can join. The UN, of course, is being one of the number one. UN was formed post World War II in 1945 with the mission of peacekeeping, where all the countries of the world can come together and talk about their differences and try to solve their differences diplomatically instead of going into war. After World War II, we also see the formation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF is responsible, and the World Bank is responsible for stabilizing economic policies and economic relations between countries and encouraging developed countries to loan money to countries that are developing their economy. So that would be an example of a developed country would be the United States, and an example of a developing economy would be Nigeria. So it's a way for the United States to facilitate and help Nigeria develop. You have regional organizations like NATO. NATO, which was formed in response to try to counterbalance Russian or the Soviet power. NATO still exists today. NATO was established in 1949. The idea is that if you fight a war with the United States, if you're the Soviet Union, you're going to go into war with all of our NATO allies. So it's kind of like a gang. European Union, we'll talk about the European Union in much more depth, but the European Union is a regional government and a regional economy that includes members of the members of Western Europe, and we'll talk about what it takes to be a member of the EU and what you have to do as a member of the EU. Like, how are you accepted and what do you have to do, your responsibilities. Multinational corporations also play a role in foreign affairs. MNCs, or transnational corporations, TNCs. These are companies that operate in many different nations. Some examples of those would be like Apple, Google, Walmart. And then you have your NGOs. Your NGOs are non-governmental organizations that operate worldwide, generally not for profit, like the World Health Organization, which tries to make sure that you fight and eradicate diseases throughout the world, and Amnesty International, which protects human rights. Okay. Then we have the president, the roles of the president. This is very much review. Okay. Congress will defer power to the president when it comes to foreign policy decisions, and so generally the president has a lot of power over foreign policy. Because he is one guy, he can act quickly and decisively. His formal powers: he is chief diplomat. He gets to receive ambassadors, recognize foreign countries. He negotiates treaties. He is also commander-in-chief, which means he gets to send troops into action and decides what weapons to use. He does have some assumed or informal powers. As the president, he gets to prepare a military budget. So he gets, like we have seen recently, Donald Trump in 2017, his budget has heavy increases, money, like he wants to direct more money to military spending. Also, executive agreements. These are informal treaties that the president makes with other countries that do not have to have approval by the Senate. Now, he can deploy troops indefinitely until the War Powers Act, and then again, the War Powers Act, Congress checked that power by saying he can only deploy troops for 60 days. He has to notify Congress, and then if he wants to keep them longer than 60 days, he has to either get an extension from Congress or a declaration of war, which is what Congress does. Under what situations does the president assume more power? During national security crisis. Then the president has a lot of departments and agencies that help him out. Which departments and agencies help him out? The Department of State. The Department of State are kind of nicknamed the Doves because they are responsible for diplomacy. All right, so diplomacy is, again, going to another country and talking out your differences and trying to compromise over how to handle certain situations, building friendships, creating allies. The Secretary of State is the top foreign policy advisor in charge of diplomacy. They're also in charge of American embassies. American embassies are scattered worldwide. You use embassies and consulates to maintain positive relations and communicate with foreign nations. So if you are the ambassador to Russia, you will meet with foreign dignitaries, you will meet with Russian officials. If we have Americans who are traveling in Russia and they have any kind of issues, they would go to the embassy to get assistance. The Department of Defense, these are your hawks, these are your militaries. Hawks are more likely to support military action. The Department of Defense is headed by the Secretary of Defense. This has got to be a civilian that runs the military. We do not have generals that are running the military. We're afraid that we would have a situation of a military coup and then having a militarized government, and we didn't want that. Also, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are the military leaders. They also advise the president when it comes to military action. And then you have the National Security Establishment. This is the National Security Council. The National Security Council, an agency created by Congress in 1947. The intention of the National Security Council was to coordinate American foreign and military policy. The National Security Council is a collection of the President, the Vice President, the Secretaries of State and Defense, and the President's assistant for national security. And when something happens and we like something that threatens the United States, and we need to address it, the National Security Council will come together to answer questions about what should the United States response be. The CIA is also important. The Central Intelligence Agency collects information in other countries, conducts some of our covert operations. Covert means secret operations to help the president make policy decisions. So I don't want to say that they spy, but they spy on people and then give that intelligence to the president when necessary if it's going to help him make a more informed decision. Okay, then you have Congress. Congress's formal war powers, military spending. Okay, since they have the power of the purse, all of the spending comes from Congress. Both houses of Congress declare war. And then Congress also passes foreign policy laws or laws that will determine how we are going to conduct foreign policy, like the War Powers Act, which limited some of the powers of the president. Checks the authority of the president. That is a major role that Congress plays. If the president or anybody in the executive branch, agencies, part of the bureaucracy, does something inappropriate when it comes to the military or comes to diplomacy, you can pull those members of the executive branch into Congress to have them answer questions and hearing and oversight committees. Congress also approves treaties, specifically the Senate. The Senate also approves appointments to like the Secretary of State, Director of CIA, Secretary of Defense positions. Also, if the president really messes up, Congress can move towards impeachment and removal. There are a lot of committees in Congress that work on writing foreign relations legislation and national security legislation. That would be the Senate and House. Both of them have particular committees that conduct this stuff. So that's Armed Services, Foreign Relations, Homeland Security, and Special Committee on Intel. What are the different instruments of foreign policy? Okay. Diplomacy. So right here, we have two pictures depicting diplomacy. Right here, you have Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, allies all of World War II. Right here, you have Richard Holbrooke. He was responsible for conducting diplomatic relations during the Bosnia Herzegovina conflicts. All right, so a couple of different instruments. You can use military. If you like to go for military as a response, you generally are considered using realpolitik. And basically, realpolitik, or using the military, is using or threatening power or force to make people comply with what you want them to do. Military alliances is part of this. Like, so you can fund certain militaries. Like, we would fund the Egyptian military to try to balance power in the Middle East. You can provide militaries with weapons, you can train them, and you can enter into security pacts like NATO. All right, diplomacy. Diplomacy is going to be more of a liberal idea or an idealism idea. This is where you're using a lot of cultural and scientific exchanges. Maybe a couple of years ago, we sent a symphony orchestra to North Korea. That just shows like goodwill and good gesture. Didn't really get us very far, but anyway, that's the kind of stuff that you would do for diplomatic relations. Offering diplomatic recognition. What we've done to Russia before is we've just recently expelled their diplomats, kicked their diplomats out, and said, like, y'all are not complying, you've messed with our election, that's one step too far, you're trying to undermine our democracy, we're going to cut off diplomatic relations with you. You can join or withdraw from negotiations. You can go to summit meetings where a bunch of countries come together and discuss problems, like climate summit meetings. And enter into membership, enter into organizations. Economic tools. One thing that you could also do as economic tool is to withhold humanitarian aid, whether that's technical, engineering, scientific, or professional assistance, medical assistance, assistance with food. If somebody isn't complying or they're not treating your country fairly, or they're not treating you fairly with trade, or they're threatening the national security of the United States, you can pull humanitarian assistance. Trade relations are also important. It's really hard to fight people that you rely on for products and that you rely on to buy your products. So entering into trade agreements is a good way to use economic tools to conduct foreign policy. And we're going to talk about trade agreements a lot more, NAFTA and the TPP. Economic sanctions. Economic sanctions would be an economic punishment. You can punish a country who's not acting fairly by raising tariffs or raising the taxes on their products that are coming into the United States, which would make Americans less likely to purchase their goods. You can cut off their bank accounts. This is something, in financial assets, which is something that we've done with Russian businesses and Russian financiers and oligarchs, is that if they've had money invested in the United States or real estate in the United States, we've cut them off financially. But when you're using economic sanctions, it's going to work best when you use them multilaterally. And multilaterally means where you use them with a lot of different countries, like with the U.S. and Cuba relations. The U.S. cut off economic relations with Cuba, and that just made us look like a bully, and it really didn't stop the Castro regime. If we had a bunch of other countries in coordination with us, especially countries that we could, like in Latin America, that we could convince to not trade with Cuba and not to work with Cuba, those sanctions would have worked better. So sanctions work better when multiple countries are carrying them out.